Thank you all for being here. Thank you for your interest in this topic. I have been working on these issues since the mid-1980s, and we have come an awful long way. You know, as Nicole said, Farm Sanctuary started by selling vegan hot dogs out of our Volkswagen van outside of Grateful Dead concerts. This last summer, I went to the last Grateful Dead show, and they were selling vegan hot dogs inside Soldier Field in Chicago. So our movement has really grown. There's more awareness now than ever about the importance of making more mindful food choices. But still, most of us, most people do have habits that we grow up with. We grow up eating animals without really thinking about it. I grew up eating animals. I actually grew up in Hollywood, California. And as a kid, my mom got me and my brothers and sisters into the Screen Children's Guild. So as a kid, I actually did commercials for McDonald's, if you can believe that. So I've come a ways, and it's all about thinking, and being mindful, and then ultimately making choices that we can feel good about, that are ultimately aligned with our values and aligned with our interests. The way we grow up eating animal foods, that's not generally aligned with our values. And so often when the topic of animal agriculture comes up and animal slaughter comes up, people say, don't tell me, I don't want to know, because it's upsetting. But I think it's important for us to be aware and to know, and to then make choices that are not dissonant. So we can eat food, know where it comes from, and still feel good about it. And the good news also is that by shifting away from eating animal foods towards plant foods, we also help ourselves. We improve our own health and well-being. We improve life on the planet. When we eat animal foods, biologically, we're best suited to be plant eaters. Carnivores have a very short intestinal tract because meat is a putrefying piece of flesh, and it has to get through a carnivore's body quickly, so they have a very short intestinal tract. Human beings have a very long, winding intestinal tract. So it takes a long time for this meat, which also has no fiber, to pass through our bodies. And as it's doing so, this is a putrefying piece of flesh that is starting to emit toxins at a certain point. And so there are health impacts of eating animal foods. And it's been estimated we could save something like 70% on healthcare costs by shifting to a whole foods, plant-based diet, away from processed foods, away from animal foods. And now I've been a vegan since 1985, and it's done very well for me. But each person has to make their own choices. And for folks that are not vegan, just starting to take steps in that direction, eating fewer animal foods, is a very good thing to do. Participating in Meatless Mondays, where one day a week, for example, people go meatless. And as you start doing that, you start becoming more comfortable with eating plant foods. You start finding substitutes for animal foods. And we're ultimately creatures of habit. And if we have unhealthy habits, it's important to think about them, assess them, and then think about changing them. And as we do that, we build momentum, and small changes often lead to bigger changes. And for me, going vegan was one of the best things I ever did. Like I said, I did it back in 1985. I'm now in my 50s, and I've run several marathons in the last couple of years, done several triathlons, including an Ironman. So you get all the nutrients you need from plant foods. And some of the elite athletes are vegans. Scott Jurek, who won the Western States 100-mile race 7 times in a row, is a vegan. He recently broke a record for hiking the Appalachian Trail faster than anybody else. There's another guy named Patrick Babuyan who is one of the world's strongest men. He carried more weight than any human had ever carried. I saw him break the record in Toronto a couple years ago. He's also a vegan. So this idea that we need to eat animal foods for our health or to be able to thrive is just a myth. And if we can live well without causing unnecessary harm to ourselves or other animals or the planet, why wouldn't we? So I'm going to go over some of Farm Sanctuary's history, talk about how we began. And as I mentioned, I grew up in Los Angeles, so I didn't have a real clear understanding of what happens to animals on farms. So I actually started going in, and I'll show some of those pictures. But first, we'll talk about what happens at Farm Sanctuary. The animals at the farm are our friends, not our food. We interact with them like most people interact with their cats and dogs. And pigs love belly rubs. Pigs can be very cuddly. We have turkeys that follow you around like puppy dogs. And when you sit down, they'll sometimes sit on your lap. And it's a place where vegan is normal. And we have beautiful sanctuaries, one in New York, 2 in California. People are welcome to come visit, spend time with the animals, spend time in nature. And I think this is very healing. The animals who come to Farm Sanctuary have come from horrible, awful factory farms where in some cases they've literally been thrown away like garbage. And this is the first animal we rescued, the sheep on the far right of this dead pile. This is a pile of dead animals behind a stockyard. And these are animals that were transported hundreds or maybe even thousands of miles to be sold. And in some cases they're sold to other farmers. In some cases they're sold to go to slaughter. But every year thousands would die. And so I was just taking a picture here of this pile of dead animals, and there were maggots so thick you could hear them buzzing. There are also dead pigs and other dead animals that you can't see in this actual slide. But on the right, this sheep lifts her head. She was alive. So we took her off the dead pile thinking she would probably have to be euthanized, but when we took her to the vet, she started perking up, and we brought her to Farm Sanctuary, and she lived with us for more than 10 years. So that is Hilda, our first rescued animal. And then I started traveling around the country to document what was happening on these farms because, again, I hadn't seen it. I wanted to know firsthand what these animals were enduring and what factory farming was doing to animals and to the earth and to workers even. And I came upon this calf at another stockyard, and he was born on a dairy farm. And because he was a male and very sick, the dairy farmer sent him to the stockyard to be sold on the day he was born. He was still wet from afterbirth. And it was a freezing day, and he was dying of hypothermia. So I went to the stockyard worker and said, "What's going on with this calf?" And he said, "I've got to bury him later today," just matter-of-factly. So I said, "Well, what if I take him off your hands?" And he said, "Sure, go ahead." So I took the calf to a vet who tried to take his temperature. It was so low it wouldn't even read on the thermometer. He was practically comatose. You can see how his eyes are sunken in. He couldn't even lift his head. But the veterinarian gave him intravenous fluids. I brought him back to Farm Sanctuary. I nursed him. And it took a day or so before he was able to even lift his head and start suckling on a bottle. But he finally did that. Then he was able to stand. He was able to walk. And he was doing a lot better, but he really wasn't thriving yet. And I wondered he seems like he's doing well physically, but he's not really thriving. And then I took him out to the cow barn. And I put him in a pen there, and the other cows all gathered around, started mooing at him, and now he was with his people, and he started perking up, kicking up his legs, and he ended up growing to be a very happy 3,000-pound animal. And he was a beautiful, gentle, his name was Opie, and he lived with us for nearly 20 years and had a great life at Farm Sanctuary. And I loved going out to the barn, and he was huge. He would we had these 10-foot by 10-foot doors. He would fill the whole space almost, but he was gentle, and it was wonderful to see him there and to share our lives with him. And that's what happens at Farm Sanctuary. We're able to interact with these animals in a positive way. And that is good for the animals, and it is also good for us. And you contrast that with what happens in these factory farms, where you have animals in these small crates where they can't move, and these animals are suffering. And people who work in those places, I think, absorb some of that. And then can you imagine what it would be like to work in a slaughterhouse, where for 8 hours a day your job is cutting the throats of animals? I mean, that is horrible for the animals. It is horrible for people. And ultimately, it's not necessary. So I continued traveling and documenting conditions. This is how veal calves are raised in these small wooden crates. Opie, if he was healthy enough, might have ended up in one of these crates, but he was very sick, and he probably would have gone directly from the stockyard to a slaughterhouse to be killed for cheap grade veal. But the veal industry was actually created to take advantage of these unwanted male calves that are born on dairy farms. For a dairy cow to have milk, she has to have a baby, like other mammals. They don't lactate for the heck of it. They lactate to feed their babies. The babies are taken away immediately after birth. If they're female, they're raised to become milking cows. If they're male, they're useless to the dairy industry, so the veal industry was actually created. So these calves are taken from their mothers, chained by the neck in crates, and that's how they would live their whole lives. And that's the veal industry, which is something that thankfully now there's been a lot of awareness about, and there's been a shift away from it. Consumers don't like this, and veal consumption has been dropping in recent years. So that's a very positive sign. But they're not the only animals that are confined in these small crates. That's a picture I took of breeding pigs at a farm in Missouri. These are what they call gestation crates because it's where they're kept during their gestation period or their pregnancy. And for 4 months they live in those crates, and then right before giving birth they put the mother pig into a separate crate called a farrowing crate, where she still just has about 2 feet of space. There's a little space on the side for the piglets to nurse when the mother lays down. The piglets nurse through the bars. And then the piglets are there for about 2 to 3 weeks. They're taken away to be fattened for slaughter. The mother is immediately re-impregnated, put right back into the gestation crate. So she lives this constant cycle of impregnation, birth, and re-impregnation in a crate that size. And that is factory farming. And when you go into these places, you hear the sows clanking against the bars to get out. They're in misery. And it is a very violent, ugly place, and the air is thick with toxic fumes from their waste, and it's not a good thing for animals or for people, and we don't need to do this. And the last confinement system I'll mention are battery cages. This is how most eggs are produced in North America, where they take chickens and put them in small wire enclosures where they can't even stretch their wings. They will live in these enclosures for a year or 2. Their feathers wear off from constantly scraping against the bars of these crates, and this is all they know. When their egg production drops off and they're no longer considered to be profitable, they're taken from these cages, and in some cases they're just buried alive because they're very skinny, their bodies are beat up, and there's not a lot of meat on their bones. There are 2 distinct types of chickens raised in the commercial poultry industry. There are the meat type birds who've been genetically bred to grow twice as big and twice as fast as normal. And there are the egg laying breeds that have been genetically bred to put all of their feed energy and their calories into egg production. So they don't get very big. And so they're not very profitable to kill. And sometimes these animals are literally thrown away when they're no longer profitable in the egg industry. There have been situations where egg factories have had them ground up alive on their farms. And there was one particular case some years ago in California where an egg factory had 30,000 spent hens. That's what they call them, spent hens, when they're no longer profitable. And he got a wood chipper to kill them. And the neighbors saw this, they were appalled. We got involved, we tried to get this guy prosecuted for cruelty to animals, but ultimately he was found not guilty because this was considered to be an acceptable agricultural practice. And that's something that is important to realize. This is an industry that is very entrenched. It is one that is very influential, and it is one that affects lawmakers. And oftentimes, in fact, lawmakers are farmers, or they go back and forth between lawmaking and agribusiness. And this is an industry that's also tied into the petroleum industry, the pharmaceutical industry, and it's very immersed. But the way things change ultimately is when citizens say, I don't want to support this anymore. The reason this industry is so powerful is because people buy their products. We vote with our dollars. We support these industries. Then they have all of this wealth that they use to influence the political process. And so by changing the way we eat and voting with our dollars in a different way, we can make an enormous shift. And it's starting to happen right now. So putting animals behind bars, raising them in crates, is bad for them. It also shuts off part of our empathy, part of our humanity. I've been into these places. I've seen what it does to people. I've seen what slaughterhouses do to people. To do that kind of a job, people have to cut off part of their heart. And that's not good for people either. And for consumers, when we participate in this and we buy these products, we also, in a sense, stop looking, stop thinking, and stop empathizing, and stop living in a way that is aligned with our values. And so the main message at Farm Sanctuary is to encourage people to live well, to live in alignment with our values, to make mindful choices. And this can make a world of difference for ourselves and for the other animals. And It's not something that happens overnight necessarily, although it can. There are some people that see these images and say, I don't want to be part of that, and they go vegan overnight. For most people, though, it happens incrementally, where people say, you know what, I don't like what they do to calves in the veal industry, I'm not going to buy veal anymore. For some people, they see what they do to these eggs in battery cages, say, I'm not going to support that. Other people say, I'm going to have more plant foods. I'm going to start going to the farmer's market. I'm going to get part of a community-supported agriculture share. And this is this whole new mechanism now where consumers invest in a farming operation at the beginning of the growing season, and they share in the bounty of the season if it's a great growing season, or they share in the risk of not a great season. So this way, small farmers have a lot of their risk taken care of. So this is a new mechanism that's actually, it's been around for a long time, but it's spreading. And this is something that's available to more and more consumers now. And there are also restaurants that are supporting local farms. There's the farm-to-table movement, which I generally support. I think it's a very good thing. The one caution I would have, however, is that in some cases, there are animals being raised in conditions and sold as humane, but oftentimes those conditions are made to sound a lot better than they are. So unless you really visit the farm and see what is happening, there's a very good chance that if you're purchasing meat, milk, or eggs, that the way they're being represented tends to sound better than it is. And a fundamental question that I think is important to ask is whether the word humane and the word slaughter fit very well together. You know, again, I'm a vegan, so I'm a vegan advocate, and would love people to consider that as something that makes sense. But also, one of Farm Sanctuary's most important organizational values is that we speak to people where they are on their own journey. Each of us has to make our own choices. You know, there's a lot of things in this world we don't have control over, but when it comes to what we eat, we do have a lot of power. And we can make choices that we can feel good about that will improve our lives and the lives of other animals as well. And the other thing about animal agriculture that is very important to realize is that it is extremely wasteful. It's much more efficient to grow plant foods and to eat those directly instead of growing plant foods, harvesting them, feeding them to farm animals, raising the animals, and then slaughtering the animals. We could save something like 10 times the resources, the water, the land, by eating plants directly instead of growing crops and feeding them to animals. We also would save on fossil fuels. There was a New York Times article a few years ago called Rethinking the Meat Guzzler. And in that article, they compared the amount of fossil fuels for a meat meal versus a vegetarian meal. They found it took 16 times more fossil fuels for the meat meal. So that's an enormous expense as well. Plus, the pharmaceutical industry and the antibiotics. The vast majority of antibiotics used are fed to farm animals to keep them alive and growing in these horrible factory farm situations. What that means is that pathogens that exist on factory farms grow resistant. And so when human beings eat foods or just come into contact with these pathogens, these formerly life-saving drugs are no longer useful, or no longer helpful. The best thing we can do is to live well, to build our immune systems, and from all the research I've seen, the best thing we can do is to eat whole plant foods to do that, and eat a variety of foods. The United Nations also talked about how animal agriculture is one of the top contributors to the most serious environmental problems our planet faces, including climate change. Animal agriculture contributes more to climate change than the entire transportation industry. So this is an industry that causes all kinds of harm to the planet and animals and ourselves. And I'll just sort of finish talking about what it does to us. You know, it causes us not to see other animals for who they are, causes us to start rationalizing horrible misbehavior. One of the first visitors to our farm in Watkins Glen, New York, was a pig farmer. And he came into our pig barn and he saw volunteers taking care of these 500-pound sows. And this pig farmer was genuinely worried about the well-being of our volunteers. These are people that weighed maybe 100 pounds each. They're in these barn with 500-pound animals. And this pig farmer said, that's a very dangerous situation. You better get out of the barn because they're going to attack you. And I said, we have not had these animals attacking us the way you're describing. And I said, often they're afraid when they first come here because they've only known cruelty at human hands. But as time goes, they learn to trust us, they learn they're in a safe place, and they don't attack us. And this pig farmer said, look, I've raised pigs for years, I understand these animals, they're violent and aggressive, and you can't trust them. He actually used these kinds of words, and he said, they're going to attack you if you don't get out of there. And to illustrate his point, he said, he told a story of a sow he had, who had babies. And he took the babies away, and the mother came after him. And he had no clue that his action caused this response. So that's the kind of thing that starts happening as we start closing down our ability to see things as they are. And there's that quote that I love that says, we don't see the world as it is, we see the world as we are. And this pig farmer's words, I think, really, sadly, spoke to that. And it doesn't have to be that way. So I guess I'll close it with that and open it up to questions. So thank you all very much.
If you tell a big story, and that's going to become kind of a theme here today, if you tell a big story, eventually that story starts to kind of fill itself out. So in 2012, in the spring, we started having people show up in these workouts that we hosted. Right here is our very first member, a woman named Sarah Wild. She's super fast.